guys, it's Dasha. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to today's video, which is a wrap-up of everything I read in the month of January. Couple things before we start. Can we get some commotion for the coffee table? Because I finally have a coffee table. I feel very accomplished considering that I've been living here for like almost a year. I just never found one that I liked, and you might have noticed that it was kind of weird that I didn't have one in my living room, but I have one. I know it's not really important, but I'm just very happy. So you're gonna see it in my videos now. I promise I'm a real adult. Also, if you want to join me, I have a little drinky poo, a little craft beer, because it's just so much more fun to sit with a beverage and chit chat. So I've got one. Finally, if you hear honking in my videos, I live in downtown Ottawa, and there is a massive protest going on with a bunch of truckers who are honking incessantly. So if you hear it, I apologize. It's what happens when you live in the city, I guess. It is what it is, and I can't do much about it. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into my books. I read 8 books, but I started 11. I had to DNF 3. Of those, I will only be talking about 2 because one was for a secret TBR secret vlog. So I won't be talking about that. This vlog is finally coming to a close, so I can finally release it. If you might remember, last year I'd mentioned that there was a couple of books in that same vlog that were like 2.5 and 1.5 stars, which is giving you an idea of how bad that vlog's going. But that aside, and those DNFs aside, I had an insanely good reading month. I had a ton of 4 and 5 star reads, which I'm kind of shocked by. Like literally only one of my reads was a 3 star. Everything else was like a 4. Actually, no, I had a lower one than that. I only had 2 like mediocre books. Everything else was pretty good. So the order past the 3 star might be kind of iffy, to be fair, because I really enjoyed a lot of the things I read. I definitely have a favorite of the month. Yeah, I have a favorite of the month. I had to think about that because, like I said, I read a lot of good stuff. I have a favorite of the month, but other than that, the order's kind of iffy. So let's start with the DNFs. The first book that I DNF'd this month was The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. This is a very weird horror fantasy. It's about a group of adults who were brought up as kids by this man they called the Father. He taught them all sorts of arcane knowledge. They lived in like this big house and they were taught these obsolete subjects, I guess, that were very, very weird, including things like necromancy, talking to animals, arcane languages, just this like really weird stuff. And it sounds very intriguing from that. Problem is, I could not get into it because it felt like the author was throwing a lot of things at you to make it seem like this group was interconnected to all these other things, but it just wasn't clicking for me. I also felt that the writing style was not bad or difficult, but it made you feel very detached from what was happening, and I found that I just truly did not care about what was going on. The plot starts with the father being missing. You get a little bit of backstory, but the book really kicks off with the father being missing and all of the siblings trying to find him. But it's just so weird and nothing was really explained, and I felt very detached from it all. I gave this book about 56 pages, and then I just said, you know what, I can't really do this. I'm not enjoying myself, and I don't really want to sit through this whole book if I know from the start that I'm not really gonna enjoy myself. A lot of the reviews that I saw on Goodreads said that it is one of those books that you have to sit through a ton of for it to start making sense, but I find my time a bit too valuable for that. I can kind of tell if something's gonna work or not for me, and this is just one of those instances where it didn't work. This is a book I would recommend to very few people because it is such a specific thing. Like, I encourage you to try it, but I would also encourage you to DNF it if you kind of feel the same way I do. I think it's a book you kind of know that you're gonna like whether you want to keep reading or not, because like I said, most of the reviews that I saw said that once they kept reading, things started making sense and they enjoyed it, but those people clearly all had the desire to keep reading, and I didn't feel that at all. It was kind of like a struggle every time I went to pick it up, so to me that was a sign that I probably wouldn't enjoy it if I did push through it. So for me, that was a pretty easy DNF, but I do still recommend it if you think you might enjoy that really weird fantasy, horror, arcane knowledge thing. It's not what I would call dark academia at all, if that's kind of the vibe you got from that. It's definitely more in this like lore fantasy mixed with some pretty gruesome stuff. It's very weird. It is definitely genre bending, if again that's something that you might enjoy, but it's just a little too weird for me. The other book I had DNF'd was Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. So this is pitched to everyone as lesbian necromancers in space. I unfortunately did not get like that far into it. I I only managed like 24 pages, unfortunately, and it was definitely a writing issue in this case. You are following at the beginning Gideon, who is trying to escape from the House of the Ninth, but I found that everything was written in such a convoluted way that I could not bring myself to care, and I didn't really want to expend the energy on trying to figure out what was happening, trying to figure out what the world was like. It just felt like very weird things were dropped on you that shouldn't have been focused on. And while I agree that world building can sometimes get a little masturbatory and way too self-indulgent for authors, I think this was the complete opposite, but also in a masturbatory way, where the author was like, I know something you don't, I know something you will never know, and they're just probably not going to tell you about it. They know how the world works, they're just refusing to tell you, and I just didn't gel with that at all. Personally, I'm so sorry. I know this book is beloved in the series. Everyone's hyped for the third book that's coming out this year. We just got the cover and stuff, but I didn't really enjoy the writing style. It's just not for me. However, this is a series I might return to if I find that like I've read through most of the books that I'm really anticipating in the fantasy and sci-fi genre, and I feel like I want something new and fresh, because this was definitely different. I will absolutely give it points for that. It's unlike anything I've ever read. I just was not gelling with it, but I'm still intrigued. There's still something there. I just didn't really want to experience it maybe at this moment. So I'm gonna put a pin in that one. I might return to it years down the road. It's definitely not something I'll come back to soon, given my massive fantasy TBR and other things that are interesting me. But if I find that everything I'm reading is getting a little too repetitive, that could be a series that I might want to turn to because of how unique it is. It's just a little too unique for me right now. Now let's get into the books I actually finished. Unfortunately, my least favorite book that I finished this month was Death a Life by George Pendle. Robin, I'm so sorry. So if you don't know, I play a TBR game every month. That's how I pick my TBR, and I had Robin pick a book that she absolutely loved for me to read, and she picked Death a Life. This is essentially Death's memoir, talking about Death's life, question mark, if you can call it that, from his upbringing all the way through to the current day. Unfortunately, I just didn't gel with the humor in this. I found it very Pixar-esque. It's just like trying to have these like moments between Death and like other characters, I guess, that just didn't really work for me. It felt a bit too cartoony. The other thing too is the prologue really gives off a different vibe than the rest of the book, and I was hooked with the prologue. I really loved it. I was like, this could be really fucking cool. In the prologue, you are following the author of the book. It's someone who writes a lot of memoirs, and he says that he was getting bored with writing about people's stories until someone contacted him, and when he went to meet the person who contacted him, it was Death, and Death was kind of reminiscing and lamenting about his life, and it sounded like it was going to get really deep and interesting, but I found that the actual rest of the book had no substance, in my opinion. It felt like it was just trying to be funny and trying to draw in all these other references, and it just didn't stick the landing for me. I think this could be someone's book if you share that sense of humor. There were things that landed for me, absolutely, but I found it was more a case where 9 out of the 10 jokes didn't land, and the ones that did land were good, but if most of them aren't landing for me, it's not really worth it. And if humor is such a central part of the book and it's not your type of humor, it doesn't really make for an enjoyable read. So while the book was not bad, it definitely wasn't for me, unfortunately. I don't have any like negative feelings toward it. I don't think it's bad in any sense of the word. I was more let down other than anything because of that really good prologue, because Robin had really loved it and we share pretty similar tastes. I think it's just a case of the humor not working for me, but it worked for her. So I think this is a book I would absolutely recommend to you if it sounds interesting. It's pretty short, super fast paced. I read this in 2 sittings. Like, it's a really quick book. Or did I read it in 1 day? It didn't take me long to read it at all. Like, it was a very quick read, especially because a lot of it is dialogue and it's kind of humorous dialogue, but it just, it didn't really work for me. I ended up giving this a 2.5 stars because it seems like the most like middle of the road rating I could think of. For every positive, I could think of a negative, and to me that just seems like a good place to land. But I don't want to discourage anyone from picking this up. I think it's really interesting. I haven't seen something done like it before. It's just the execution of it was not successful for me. The next book I want to talk about is And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. This is a classic mystery about a group of people who are sent these mysterious invites to an island that's got a bit of a mystery even surrounding its like origins and who owns it and all that. Once they arrive onto the island and they start having dinner, they notice that things start going downhill, and one by one people start dropping dead. Now, this is considered iconic in the mystery genre. This is a book that started a million other books because of its unique premise, and I absolutely could see why it kept readers hooked for years and years and years. It was really engaging, it was really quick to read, and it was exciting. Or is this the one I read in one sitting? I think this is the one I read in one day, but Death also took me like 2 sittings to read. It wasn't a long book, but I read all of And Then There Were None in a day because it was very, very engaging and intriguing. It was fun to sit there and guess who the murderer was, and Miss Agatha Christie is really good with red herrings and misdirections. I find that every time you thought that you had a reason to suspect someone was the murderer, there was also a very good counter reason for why they couldn't be the murderer. So you were just left kind of not trusting yourself even to solve the mystery. I found the resolution quite satisfying. I really enjoyed the explanation for everything, and while I didn't guess it the whole way, I kind of guessed it, so I really enjoyed being able to see whether I was right and all that stuff. The reason I did not like love it was because I found the characters to be kind of caricatures, and I know that the whole point of this kind of book is not the characters, but I felt like it would have made a lot more sense. I very rarely say this, but I felt like the book should have been a little bit longer to give us a bit more time with the characters, because the reason for all of them being on the island was pretty intriguing, and I felt like we didn't see enough of certain people to understand fully their motivations behind what was happening before and the reason they got to the island and at the island. I felt like there was just a little bit of a disconnect between me and the characters, so when they died, it didn't feel as monumental. The characters that I did care about, or rather understood, when they died, it was a lot more interesting to me. So I guess maybe I'm not a fan of Christie's characters. It was also written a really long time ago, so there's a lot of inappropriate things, and also like books were written really differently. For the mystery engine that ran this book, it was fantastic, but there was other things about the writing and the characters that I didn't quite love. So this ended up being a 3.5 star for me. Like, there's not a lot of things I could explicitly say were wrong. I just didn't like love it, but it was pretty cool, and I would recommend this if you do, like, if you're thinking of picking up Agatha Christie, but if you're not sure maybe about her writing or whatever. It's pretty easy to get through. It's really, really fast-paced and exciting, and the beginning might be a bit of a slog. I remember my boyfriend had mentioned that he tried reading this and he could not get through the beginning because it was just a lot of exposition of the characters. It's worth it to stick it through, because once they arrive at the island and people start dropping dead, it's great. It's really, really fun. It's really fun to try to see if you can pick up the threads of who is it, who's doing this, do we think it's this person or that person, but that could be wrong. It's a really, really good time. I would actually go back and reread this to see if I could spot what was happening behind the scenes. So like I said, I would still recommend this. It didn't like super resonate with me, but I had a really, really fun time with it. And obviously if I read it in one sitting, it means it's very engaging and intriguing. All right, the next book I want to talk about, I'd actually started back in December, but I just didn't get a chance to finish it with the holidays and stuff. So I decided to be good and finish books that I start, because I have a problem with that. And so I finished Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes-Dumez, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. This is essentially, there's a lot packed into this. First of all, the author is essentially giving an overview of the history of white evangelicalism in the US and their ties with politics. But there's a lot more than that. You might wonder why like John Wayne is mentioned, for example. She also brings in a lot of discussions about masculinity within the evangelical movement and how they had an issue with it at first, so they turned to very masculine idols like Teddy Roosevelt and John Wayne, even though they were not the perfect embodiments of Christianity, how they were embodiments of rugged masculine power. And so it turned into just a lot of really interesting discussions. Additionally, because I am not living in the US, I have very little knowledge of evangelicalism in the US. I'm personally not someone who follows that very closely. It's hard to really keep up with it when I live in Canada and we have our own issues, but I thought this was a really good introduction to it. However, I would not say that if you're looking for that, but you're not a history person, that this is a good pick for you. This is very academic, it's very dense writing, it's very hard to get through in the sense that like there's a lot of information, a lot of names and dates. But I found since I'm personally used to reading that kind of historical text, it worked great for me because I felt like I got a lot of really good stuff from it that I could use further and to further my research and to look up. If you see here, I have flags that are, the blue and red are just like stuff I found interesting. There's a lot of green and yellow flags, which I use for things that I want to come back to and look up later. So there was a lot in here. A lot of things I didn't know about US history. A lot of conclusions were drawn that kind of demonstrated why evangelicals act the way that they do that I didn't realize. So it was really good from that standpoint of understanding their movement, understanding the history of it, because the why and the how is just as important as the who, what, where, when. And so I thought from that perspective, it was fantastic. I do have like a few very small gripes with it. I think that at times it was a little bit self-indulgent in the details. I think for someone who does not study the evangelical movement or theology in the US, there's a lot of names and people referenced and places and events that the normal person would not really know. And it just felt like the author was really trying to, I don't know if it was name dropping or if it's just assuming that the reader knows more than they do. I just didn't find that really enjoyable at times because I would like to know who these people are. And I didn't really feel necessary to drop them if it wasn't going to be elaborated on. The other thing too is there was a lot of people that we focused on very, very closely. So for example, there was a whole section on feminism and how white evangelical women decided to counter the feminist movement that was happening, I think in like the 60s, 70s, 80s. And while it was really interesting to see the ways in which they went about it and how some of the like big figures in the movement went about opposing feminism, it didn't feel necessary to cover so many books and people and events that took place and conventions and all this other stuff. I felt like it could have been condensed a little bit, but there were some sections to kind of counter that. There were some sections that were like really, really interesting, really in depth, and I felt like it needed it. For example, when she was talking about the history of masculinity and Christianity in general, that whole first section I found just absolutely fascinating because she went in step by step and she really gave you the roadmap for understanding how we got to the point that we did. And so for that, I thought it was great, really in depth. It almost was just too in depth at times, but I would still absolutely recommend this. I gave this 4 stars. I really, really liked it. I definitely want to read up more on the topic and, like I said, do further research on some of the things presented in here. I just think it's such an interesting text. I've never quite read anything like it. The kind of argumentative nature of it was just so well done. You can tell she's an academic and came through, and I really, really enjoyed it. Like on my scale of favorite nonfictions, this would definitely place up on the list because I think it's really, really good and I can't wait to read more in this topic. All these next ones are like, I don't even know how to, I'm just gonna take them in the order in front of me. I made a whole video on this trilogy, so if you want to go watch a full review, you can, but I know not everyone wants to. So I'm going to talk about Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb. This is the 3rd book in the Farseer trilogy, which follows Fitz. I've talked about this series a lot on my channel. I absolutely fell in love with it last year and into this year, so I won't harp on too much about it, but this was the 3rd installment. This concluded the entire arc, but it did not conclude Fitz's story. He still has 2 more trilogies in this realm of the Elderlings, so I'm very much looking forward to reading that. But I thought this 3rd book was a great conclusion. I thought that while at times it got a little bit tedious, and if I was rating it objectively, if there is such a thing, it would be a 4-star. I would give it a 5-star based off feelings. Some of my favorite moments in the entire series happened in this book. Some of the most beautiful, heart-wrenching things I've ever read, period, were in this book, and I just absolutely loved it. It was such a good conclusion to me. Yes, some things could have been better. Yes, some things were kind of unsatisfying, but overall, I do like how it played out. I love that we got more magic in this. I love that we got more Fool in this in a different setting that we did before, if that makes sense. We only saw the Fool in the Keep, but he was kind of presented in a different light in this, which I really, really loved. We got more Katrikin, and she's a fantastic character. There's just a lot of really, really good stuff in here. I loved this series overall. It's definitely cemented itself as like a favorite series of all time for me, and this book was just another fantastic entry, so I absolutely love this. If you want a full review, please go check it out. I will link it up here because I think I don't know, I enjoy diving into it a lot deeper and really going over what I thought of each of the aspects of the story a little bit more deeply. But yeah, if you want quick thoughts, I loved it. I thought it could have been better, but at the end of the day, it tugged at my heartstrings so much that I didn't really care. The next few books I'm going to talk about are also going to have their own dedicated video review, so keep your eye out for that. I'm going to not go into too much detail as a result. However, I know some people don't like watching reviews, so I will talk about them. I read the entirety of the Poppy War trilogy in January, which I did not really expect. It wasn't on my TBR, but I had just the urge to reread the first book and get back into the series and finish it. And so I did. I'm pretty proud of myself. I had read the first book, The Poppy War, before. This follows Rin, who is a young orphan girl from a very poor province. She decides to take a test to get into the best military academy because it's her only shot at a somewhat good life. Otherwise, she's going to be married off to this old man. So she decides to take the test and she gets accepted, but she realizes that not only is training to be a soldier incredibly difficult, and it's very different from what she thought it was going to be. There's also the issue of the actual war that breaks out while she is still studying. Now, she gets through most of her studies, but at the end of the day, she's still not an adult that is fully experienced in warfare. So she has to do that. The other component to this book is shamanism. In this world, there are 64 gods that this nation believes in, and Rin is able to call down one of them and basically let the god use her as a vessel on Earth. And I think that's one part that, like, especially when the book just started being popular, that's one thing that people always forgot to talk about, which blew my mind, because I'm like, they literally take drugs to talk to the gods, and you guys are not mentioning this, so I'm mentioning it. If you were put off by this because everyone talks about how brutal it is, which it is, absolutely, this series does not shy away from any nasty things. There's other such cool parts to it that I think are still worth it, like the shamanism, that I think it's still worth trying. I think the strengths of this series were consistent throughout, and those strengths are the history that R.F. Kuang infused into it, the military aspect of it, the military fantasy component, as well as the lore and mythology. I think characters took a little bit of a backseat. While you are just following Rin the whole time, there's still a way to make it like a really character-driven story. That's not what this is, in my opinion. I think this is really focusing on military history and lore. Listen, other people might have other opinions. I know a lot of people love the characters. For me, it's just not the strength of this. It's definitely the sheer amount of history packed into this. It is the incredible building of the lore that drives these gods and the shamanism, and how there's different ways to access them, and there's different gods and how they all interact is just so freaking cool. And then the military part is my personal favorite part. I absolutely love that we get so much focus on war, and none of it is glamorized, and Rin thinks that it might be, and her whole character is just trying to grapple with the realities of war, not only the brutality, but also her own ambitions and her capabilities. I gave The Poppy War 5 stars. I thought this was such a solid beginning, and I had really, really high hopes for the rest of the series. Unfortunately, the other 2 books got 4 stars each from me, with The Burning God being probably my least favorite. I was just frustrated by the end with Rin's character, because I felt like once you'd gone through all of this, aka a war that lasted several years, losing a lot of people that are close to you, you would think that the character would begin to realize certain things, but Rin didn't, and it drove me insane. And while it could be part of her character, I also felt that it was somewhat lazy. I felt that there could have been a lot more focus on Rin learning these lessons and trying to move forward, having learned them. But there kind of wasn't. Rin still made a lot of decisions with her hot-headedness, and while that is part of her personality, it's part of who she is, and I completely understand that, I felt like it just did a great disservice to what this could have been. However, I found the conclusion in Burning God great. I personally really, really liked it. I thought that overall there was a good amount of intrigue throughout the series. Like, Dragon Republic had absolutely no middle book syndrome. I tore through it. It was fantastic. I absolutely loved it. So overall, I gave the series, I guess it would be like a 4-star if it has 1 5-star and 2 4-stars. It's great. It's really, really good. It's so strong. It's so unique. There's like no romance, which I love. And it's just so freaking cool. Anyways, I'll babble on more about it in the review that will be coming soon. But yeah, I read the whole thing in January, and I loved my experience. What more can I say? If you haven't yet read this, absolutely give it a shot. if you think you might like it. All right, we are on to the final book I finished in the month of January, and that is How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr. This is a nonfiction book about America's imperialist past and present. It really talks about every aspect of American colonialism and imperialism. It goes all the way back to when America was just the 13 colonies and their expansion. It talks a lot about the Philippines, which, call me ignorant, I never knew that the Philippines were an American colony. I feel like a lot of Americans don't know that the Philippines were an American colony, to be quite honest with you. It's just not talked about that much. Honestly, this whole book I would recommend to literally everyone because of how informative it was. It was absolutely eye-opening, the atrocities that the US had committed. The hold it has on the world and how it got to that was also covered in the book, and I thought that was just the most fascinating thing. And I feel like that part of US history is not talked about, and while I don't study in the US and some of those things might be covered in school, I feel like in the greater narrative we don't view America as imperialist in the same way that we view Britain, but it still had those same tendencies. And then we also cover in this book the new American imperialism, such as the spread of the English language, the spread of American standards, friggin' US army bases across the entire world, and how it came to be and how they switched from that physical territorial colonial mindset to this other strategy that contained less physical manifestations of American power, but were still just as harmful. It's such an interesting read. And the other thing I loved about this was that the writing was just absolutely fantastic. There was a little bit of humor at times, but the author never shied away from how cruel the US could be. He never shied away from the more brutal truths of what happened. And it was presented in a very unbiased way that I really, really appreciated. And it's just overall like a really easy read. For being a pretty lengthy nonfiction, I thought it was a very accessible read, which is why, again, I would recommend it to literally everyone. I just thought it was absolutely phenomenal. There was like those little moments of humor, but then there was also those really profound moments that made you think, holy shit, I thought I knew history, and apparently I don't. And I personally really, really loved that. I thought that was such a strong part of it, that it was able to just pull you in and get you to sit down and read about a history you never knew. I just thought it was fantastic. I have like no complaints about this book. I think all Westerners should read this, especially all Americans, but all Westerners, because I don't live in the US. I might have an American citizenship, but I do not consider myself American, if that makes sense. But I live in Canada, and in Canada, more things are coming out about our past and there's more discussions being had, but not in this context of like the American imperialism and how their country has spread its ideology. So that was just absolutely fascinating. Like I loved every minute of reading that book, and I would absolutely recommend it even if you might not be into nonfiction. I think this is such a great read. Just absolutely fantastic. There you have it, friends. That was everything I read in the month of January. It was a lot more than I expected, to be quite honest with you. If it wasn't for like the Poppy War trilogy, the number would have been lower, but I just like swallowed that series. It reads so easily, and I was just devouring those books, and then I had like the more dense stuff in between. That was a lot of fantasy, so I'm gonna pivot to a little bit less. If you saw, my February TBR is up. If you haven't seen it yet, do go check it out. I'm talking about all the things I'm gonna be reading in February, and there's a lot of interesting stuff on there. Also a little bit of a chaotic TBR, much like this nonsense. But yes, let me know if you've read any of these, what you thought. Do check out my full review for the Farseer trilogy, and keep your eye out for the Poppy War trilogy review, which will be coming very soon if you want more in-depth thoughts. And I would love to hear your thoughts on the other books that I'd read. Absolutely. My social media is linked down below. You guys can always come talk to me there. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.